Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Please keep your mics off. Okay, we're going to start. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are watching us from. Welcome to the sixth session of the Global Cybersecurity Forum. My name is Oscar Avila. I am the president of the Eyes of Cybersecurity SIC, and I am delighted to kick off this session, Cybersecurity Risk, Progress, and the Way Forward in Latin America and the Caribbean, Caribbean focus. A couple of announcements. Please keep your mics off during the session. Use the chat box to formulate your comments or questions. And we will have a Q&A session at the end. That said, I will hand over to Niel Harper, our esteemed moderator. Niel, the floor is yours.
Oscar, I appreciate it. Good afternoon, good day, everyone. My name is Niel Harper. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for the United Nations Office for Project and Services. Before that, I worked for the Internet Society as Director of Global Capacity Building, where I was responsible for leading their international training and development in terms of online and offline training, as well as fellowships. So in terms of this session, as you can see, this session is titled Cybersecurity Risk, Progress, and the Way Forward in Latin America and the Caribbean, a Caribbean focus. So, you know, as many of the governments in the region transition to digital economies and transition to more online services, they're faced with a number of risks, particularly cyber risks. And there are a number of key policies and an initiative that must be put in place from national cybersecurity strategies to critical infrastructure protection, to crisis communication, to legal and regulatory reform, to education. So we really want to explore, you know, what are some of those risks? What are some of the initiatives that we need to do? How do we adjust and better move towards these ICT enabled economic systems? Our featured speaker today is Kerry-Ann Barrett. She is the Cybersecurity Policy Specialist for the Organization of American States. In her capacity, she offers technical assistance to member states in the development and implementation of the national cybersecurity strategies, as well as assists in the implementation of various projects as it relates to cybersecurity. So with that being said, I will give the floor to Kerry-Ann.
Thanks, Neil, and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Oscar, for inviting the OAS to make this presentation. I'm going to walk you through some of the things that we're seeing at the OAS as some of the risks that the Caribbean is facing. We'll be speaking about some of the results, so some of the progress we've made in the region as well in the Caribbean towards strengthening our cybersecurity resilience. For me personally, I think that we've gone a long way, and I'll try to highlight some of the, not just the risk, but some of the things that we have done really well that we could build on. As Oscar pointed out, at the end, we'll have Q&A, and I'll try to make myself as available as possible. And any questions we can't answer at the end of the webinar, I'll provide my email address, and you can always email us at the OAS, and we could provide some updates. Just as a disclaimer, the thoughts expressed during this presentation do not necessarily reflect those of the General Secretariat of the OAS or its member states. It's us presenting as technical officers within the OAS. So I want to start by giving you a macro view of some of the regional trends that we're seeing. I'll give you some Latin American as well as drill down into some of the Caribbean trends. Overall, Latin America and the Caribbean has a very high internet penetration. But one of the things that we've been noticing is that we've seemed to be less prepared to counter cyber crimes specifically. So this means that as governments impose probably stricter measures to attempt to control what's happening, sometimes it may make us more vulnerable as they try to probably implement even stricter cybersecurity measures for themselves. In terms of data, there's now a larger flow of data, especially what's happening with COVID, and I'll give you some COVID stats as well later in the presentation. Our work has transformed throughout the region. I think many of our governments didn't recognize that we would have had to move so many of our data online and having to work virtually, not just within our own ministries and governments, but also across the region. We've had so many CARICOM meetings that have been held virtually with some prime ministers presenting them, also having to adapt their way of working with their constituents and with other regional partners. So our relationships have changed as well, where we are so accustomed to interacting in person, and now that reality has completely shifted. We do have a CSIRTs platform that we have that's called ccertsamerica's.org. Some of you in the room are actually members and access data. It's open to national certs only at the moment. And national certs are able to see some of the threats that are coming to them from various bodies. So for example, we've noticed that phishing in the region has increased. We have some common targets. And we have some observations where a lot of it has been related to service payments and with fake technical support, which is what a lot of persons tend to click on. PayPal as well, Microsoft, many of us are connected to Microsoft for most of our enterprise-wide services for our everyday operations within government, for example, and the private sector. Some other more specific examples related to the Caribbean, not just in the region, is that for September alone, we noticed that the Caribbean had reported almost 780 spam accounts. Of it, 66 of it are government-related Caribbean accounts. 13 of them were .edu Caribbean accounts. So just to give you an example, and the reason why this is a threat is that a lot of them are compromised official government accounts that we're seeing. And these accounts can be, for example, peter.john@example.gov.cc. And many of these have been used for infiltrating spam, sextortion, phishing, malware distribution. So many of our governments may not even realize that their official government email addresses are compromised. Some of the common patterns that we're seeing with these email spams that are coming out is that persons get caught because they would see in their email headings, COVID-19 Relief Fund Global Giving. So it's something that's very practical, very current. And as an official person for the government, they may just click on the link. They may say to you, security alert, your account was compromised. And for many of us, as soon as we see that, we automatically jump and click to change our account. And oftentimes that's the phishing email that causes you to expose yourself rather than to actually protect yourself. You may see an email that says that there's a video that your friend sends. They probably have searched your email and actually recognize that you have a friend called Madison, and they'll just send an email that, hey, Madison has sent a video, and some persons would click on it because we're still in a social media age and our government officials aren't immune to participating on social media platforms. So these common patterns have been evident. The OAS has just recently published a report with the IDB It's the second report of its kind where we're able to produce a document that covers 32 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's an analysis that takes into account the cybersecurity maturity model from the Oxford University. Some of our member states, we usually send out the report to them. We would have a questionnaire that goes along 5 dimensions. Dimension 1 speaks to cybersecurity policy and strategy. Second one is culture, what we commonly call awareness. That's distinguished from education and training, which is dimension 3. Legal and regulatory frameworks, which takes into account standards, legislation, and then, but standards and organization and technologies is what we would look at in terms of some of the technical standards that would be out there, including insurances. From the 2020 report, we noticed that 17 out of 32 countries have been promoting public policies and initiatives to strengthen cybersecurity. This may not be strategies, but it could be that they have a very general approach to promoting cybersecurity initiatives within their country. In 2016, we only had 6 countries with national strategies. Today, there are 13. As we speak, Belize is launching theirs. So well, they'll be launching theirs between now and November. So I think it may be today that they're actually advancing on it. And that's really the 13th country. Over 17 countries in the region have legislation in place that actually protects privacy of data of individuals. This includes Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, among others, including Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, all have data protection legislation. In terms of advancement, between 2016 and now, we realized that the Caribbean sub-region largely remained at the startup stage in terms of level 1 of maturity across the board. This sub-region saw limited changes compared to its initial 2016 assessment. But we have noticed that within the Caribbean, there's a lot of discussion and attempts to actually move or advance on this. Many of our member states in the Caribbean recognize that one of the largest things that challenges them is human resources and being able to secure that human resource. From our observation, it's not a matter of lack of knowledge that cybersecurity is a pressing concern, and that's one of the greatest advances that we've seen, that our governments throughout the region do see this as an important issue. I think what has been a struggle is determining how to advance on it. In the Southern Cone generally, we've seen advances in legal and regulatory frameworks. In the Andean as well, we're seeing cybersecurity standards and technical controls coming up as more evident. In Central America and Mexico, cyber culture, education, training, and skills is something that has been advanced. And in the Caribbean, our legal and regulatory frameworks have advanced a lot. In terms of strategy development generally, in the Caribbean, we have seen that many of them have tried to align the strategies that they're developing or attempted to develop to their digital, what they want to do in terms of digitizing the government or digitizing the country. And that's a very good practice where they recognize the need to align their plans for economic development, tying into digital advancement, and trying to ensure that their cybersecurity strategy walks in line with other ICT policies that they may have. Many of them have been working towards establishing incident response capabilities, which is pretty good. And those who are able to have been advancing on some of their legal and regulatory frameworks. Important gaps across the region. Many of our countries have limited coordination among key stakeholders, which is something that could help to move the bar a little bit further. There's an average maturity in the region between 1 and 2 for many of the countries, and that's not bad compared to the globe. Some of the countries who have been advanced in terms of are at level 4 or 5, it's because they've been doing this much longer than the Caribbean, and it's something that they have prioritized as a necessity for their economic growth as well, but they've actually structured themselves towards that. In terms of capacity building, most countries have started formulating some capacity initiatives. These are challenged, as I said, because of coordination among their stakeholders, the ability to make strategic decisions regarding allocation of cyber resources, and the inability sometimes to implement some monitoring evaluation. So it's something that does challenge us. In terms of strategy and content, a lot of countries are at level 3 because many of them have started. So because we now have 13 out of the 30, well, if you count the US and Canada, we have 15 in the region in terms of national cybersecurity strategies out of 34 in total. We have 6 countries who are pretty advanced in doing it. Many of these countries are leaders in the Caribbean, and in terms of how advanced they are, it's because they're thinking about it within the context of their national development. Those who do have strategies, for example, Trinidad and Jamaica, already approved. They're in the process of reviewing those strategies and seeing how it aligns to new priorities for the government. So overall, I can say that in terms of strategy development, most of our member states have either begun to engage not only the OAS, but other development organizations such as the World Bank or ITU, or even in terms of just seeking assistance from bilateral relationships to advance their national cybersecurity strategies. Several of our member states have also incorporated the provisions of the Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime into its laws. Jamaica is an example, Trinidad and Tobago in its draft, Dominica, Grenada. Many of them, although they have not acceded to the Budapest, they've taken into account the provisions in the Budapest Convention for their laws. And that's actually a very great step because it would mean being able to cooperate with other partners globally for the investigation of cybercrime. So in summary, in terms of results, Latin America and the Caribbean has been making great strides in our views as a focus area in the region, cybersecurity being prioritized. We're not where we want to be. I don't think it will ever be perfect, but we're advancing. The COVID-19 pandemic only makes us realize that other events are going to come about. And as we increasingly rely on digital technologies, as the world moves forward, incidents like this will happen, cyber incidents will happen. We wanted to emphasize that coordination, cooperation at all levels it's critical to either reviewing your strategy, developing, establishing your CERT. You can consult with public-private partnerships as an option. Multi-stakeholderism is something that we promote at the OAS because with cybersecurity, it touches on every facet of society, from our kids all the way up to our parents, our grandparents. And it's critical to ensure that when we put policies in place, we're thinking about all, not just our own priorities as government or as private sector, but the end users, which is usually the vulnerable among us. In terms of the way forward, we want to encourage the continuous development and updating of national cybersecurity strategies. We believe that this is a critical component to governments having a strategic view going forward and being able to coordinate. One of the things that you don't want is an uncoordinated response where you may have a critical infrastructure, such as your power, being affected, and they have no one to call within government, or they have no partnership with an entity that's technical that could assist them. A national cybersecurity strategy essentially provides a framework within which that coordination and cooperation can happen holistically. We also encourage Caribbean countries becoming more involved in our international processes, especially now that it's virtual. For those who may not know, the UN has 2 processes going on right now. It's called the UNGGE, which you can't be a member of right now, but you can at least follow the discussions online. And that speaks to what we call international norms, which allows countries to actually adhere to some good practices as state and what we call managing state-on-state behavior. The open-ended working group is something that we would like to see more Caribbean countries participating in. I can speak very strongly that at one of the last meetings we went to, we were able to have Antigua represented, and Antigua was actually able to provide remarks on behalf of the region during that meeting. And I think for us, it was a high level of attention on the fact that the Caribbean has a lot to contribute to the discussion. And we would want to encourage more. For those who want to know more about this from the government level, they can always reach out to us directly at the OAS, and we can offer support for you to be able to participate or at least follow these discussions more, because they are important, because any decisions taken at the UN level does impact us as developing nations, and being able to contribute that view, taking into account some of our challenges, which we've spoken about earlier in the report's results, is critical. Also, we would want to encourage as a way forward regional cooperation. The OAS tries to cooperate as much as we can within the limits that we have in terms of human resources with our partners in the region. We have a points touch base all the time we can with CARICOM impacts, for example, and lend them our support whenever we're able to. We try to support LATNIC whenever we can. Oscar reaching out to us to do this. We try to accommodate and facilitate, ensuring that we have some amount of regional cooperation. We may not be able to touch base every day, but I think regional bodies as well play a part in this. And we believe that you can actually learn some things from these exchanges. COVID, we wanted to just give a little bit, a tad tip on COVID, just so at least you're aware. This is data that would have been, we'd have gotten from about June, July, earlier this year, but there are current reports that you could access. There has been an uptick. I think it's now surpassed 50% increase in data traffic. So we know that cyber criminals are looking at this because they now have a wealth of information they didn't have before COVID, with a lot of us who are not online. Healthcare institutions have become a target. Interpol has published a report on COVID and cyber attacks. You could just Google it and it will pop up. It's a very good report to look at. And then we've actually seen, even within our region, an upsurge in phishing websites. They've taken advantage of COVID and websites have been popping up. And a lot of our persons who are disadvantaged because they've either lost their jobs or they don't know where to get information concerning COVID and testing and symptoms. Everyone is Googling COVID and it's become a hot spot to create fake websites for persons to click on to get data. So being able to produce accurate data and making it publicly available to your citizens is really key right now, because if they know that they can go to this trusted source for data, we encourage that you consider that. As I wrap up, I'm just going to tell you what we do within the OAS and how we structure ourselves for cyber. SICTE Secretariat, within which the cybersecurity program sits, focuses on capacity building for cybersecurity, or Ministers of Justice meeting, REMHA in Spanish. They focus on legislation development and ensuring that member states can amend their legal frameworks to align to the Budapest and be able to cooperate and accede to the Budapest if they're able to. Our sister body, CTEL, focuses on telecommunications regulations, updating our member states' regulations to ensure that it's in line, or their broadband, everything to make sure it's in line with current and global practices, especially good practices. All of this is done in a very structured way where we have mandates given to us as early as 2002, when we did the Inter-American Convention Against Terrorism, and then we had the OAS Hemispheric Cybersecurity Strategy that was published in 2004. Shortly after that, between, I think it would have been 2011 or 2012, if I'm not mistaken, we also had one specifically for the Caribbean. We support member states in the development of political capacities and technical capacities, so focus on government and private sector, civil society. We improve cooperation through information sharing, coordination among stakeholders, and we increase access to knowledge and information through the reports that we have. As I close, so we could open the floor for any questions we have. For us, we wanted to do a call for action generally, just to encourage those of us on the call to look at your national frameworks to ensure that you're adapting to the current reality that is. Many of us are now online, never expected to be. Some countries are thinking about issues and apps that their kids are exposed to that they didn't have any policies in place to address that. So we wanted to encourage you to improve your international cooperation, because you can learn from your partners in the region, you can learn from international bodies, you can learn from bilateral relationships with more mature states. So think about that and unify your awareness raising efforts. If it is that we have a national level awareness campaign, that it may not have to be big, it doesn't have to be fancy, but at least if it has a very unified messaging that can be drilled down to your primary schools, it could be drilled up to your tertiary schools and within your government, and you should be able to begin to change the mindset of the people. So on that note, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I'll give the floor back over to Niel.
Excellent presentation. So we will now open the floor for any questions and from the group. So feel free to put your hand up and pose your questions. Anyone? Not seeing any hands up.
I'm seeing a question in the chat from
Okay.
Kevin, so maybe we could check the chat as well, Neil, if you want to look there.
Yes, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat either. Everyone, this is a very good opportunity to pose. Oh, we see a question from Kevin has his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, a very pleasant good morning to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, happy midday wherever you are. Just wanted to thank you, Kerry-Ann, for this very insightful and concise presentation on the report I was conducted. I refer to the comment that I made before, which was just, I like the point you had raised about the alignment between cybersecurity strategies and other digital economy plans, which I think is very critical. At this juncture, I think the entire region has been thrown into seriously considering digital, not only as a pivot, but we see right now the vulnerability and the flaws within reliance on tourism, for instance. And therefore, there needs to be much longer term thinking as to what we do in the digital space, especially as we do things like encouraging digital nomadism, and just a variety of different types of activities that we are seeing now in the Caribbean. My question is it's not too complicated. I think it's alluded to with what you have presented. Is there a sufficient way of looking or measuring the institutional capacity across the Caribbean for having robust cybersecurity? And when I refer to that, I'm talking about going beyond the presence in a binary fashion of whether or not we have the appropriate legal frameworks, but understanding that we have somewhat cohesive systems where there's knowledge within law enforcement, there's operational CSIRTs, there's the capacity building aspect, and then there are things like actual investigations or prosecutions, which lean more towards the justice system. Because for some reason, I'm always curious as to what's happening in the justice sector, which I don't think a lot of spaces tend to focus on. I know it's a very privileged group with their own characteristics. So that's just my general question. And if you have any sort of ideas as to what could give that sort of cohesive view as well, I'd be more than happy to hear about them.
Thanks, Kevin. I won't be able to answer your question directly because I think it's something that most regional organizations are trying to figure out, and even international bodies offering assistance to the Caribbean. But what I would say is something that we have articulated on more than one platforms is because of the sovereignty of each of the states within the Caribbean, taking into account that all the legal frameworks are at different stages, it's really rested that in order to have that kind of regional assessment, it's for each country to kind of carry their own capacities up to a certain level, like a minimum level, in order to do a fair comparison. And that's usually predicated on challenges that the country themselves may face. So for example, how, I'll try and give, and this is just me speaking candidly because of, if you think about, for example, Dominica, I always talk about Dominica because I believe that they have always strived to improve their cybersecurity capacity in various ways, but being vulnerable as a nation state to some of the physical threats. So for example, Dominica was very advanced in their strategy, very advanced in pursuing their incident response team. And then they ended up with a really bad hurricane and then a really bad storm the next year. So for each of the Caribbean countries, their priorities ended up shifting because of challenges that they may be facing that affects their citizens more severely than just digital threats. And I think that is the priority ranking that a lot of us have had to balance, which is why at OAS, what we've been doing with our member states is that we try to just walk where they are. So that vulnerability that they have really, really affects them. So the short answer to the question, I believe, is that a holistic, the reason why we do the CMM report with the IDB the way we do by not ranking our countries together, but recognizing that each country will be at a different stage of development because of their national priorities, their funding. Everyone has a different debt level in the Caribbean. Everyone has just gone through renegotiating about 6 years ago with the EU for trade agreements. So all of those things impact on Caribbean states differently. For those who are heavily reliant on tourism, for example, that would have to be a priority. Those who are doing energy, like Barbados, that becomes a priority. So the short answer is a region-wide analysis may not be as beneficial as probably taking each country to work with them individually to get them to a very basic level, which I think many of them have been working on to do their legislation, as you said. And then the next stage would be that training and capacity that's needed. I hope that answers you, but trying not to be too prescriptive. That's one of the approaches that we've been taking by taking them individually at this stage until we have a greater maturity in the region.
Okay. We have a question from Rodney Taylor in Barbados, and he's asking, how do we help to shift some of the responsibility for cybersecurity away from individual citizens and governments and more to the providers of internet services and infrastructures, that being ISP, registrars, cloud providers?
One of the recommendations that we've made that has worked in a lot of the Latin American countries is bringing them in the room when we're looking at our cybersecurity strategies development process. By bringing them in the room, you're able to ask them very frank questions. For example, are they willing to do voluntary reporting instead of the government mandating them reporting cyber incidents and vulnerabilities? Are they able to support awareness raising campaigns? Are they able to, at a minimum, at least issue guidance to persons whenever they have to send out or expand broadband throughout the, not even broadband, but at least internet throughout the country? So the short answer, Rodney, is we usually encourage a discussion. We've seen great successes in other countries. For example, Costa Rica, they had their ISPs as part of the discussions throughout. So the CERT was able to build a very specific relationship with them for incident handling. In some other countries, the ISPs support the government in providing data as much as they can, and they work closely with law enforcement. It's just that sometimes they're not willing to enter like specific agreements with law enforcement. It's more informal to be able to advise it. And for some countries, I've seen that they have used the regulators as a way to talk to them, where they bring the regulator into the room, and the regulator is the interlocutor between the government and the ISPs, and build a relationship that way. But the greatest thing to do that shift is relationship building, which doesn't come overnight. But if the government continue to show good faith in terms of their willingness to work with them, and also to ensure that they can provide best practice and guidance to them, ISPs usually respond much better and will cooperate. With what we've seen, they cooperate a lot as well.
Just to add to that as well, I think what's important is trust as a foundation. Those relationships have to be built on trust, especially with service providers, ISPs, etc., based on their business objectives, based on their propensity to keep the details of their network security secret. You really have to build a lot of trust by bringing them to the table, outreach, a lot of discussions around, focusing on a collaborative goal, which would be national security and securing the critical infrastructure. So again, it's really important to build that trust. We have a question from Crystal Howell. Are there any avenues for government entities to solicit funding for developing cybersecurity programs?
In essence, we have seen that a lot of countries have attempted to solicit it through regional bodies, for example. Some of the regional bodies themselves have gone out and gotten grants and loans. Some countries have, some of the developing organizations do offer grants and loans as well, that countries can go out directly. But one of the things that we have been encouraging is if it is that a country decides to go out to get a loan to advance their cybersecurity, is to make sure that you start thinking about it from a very organized, coordinated, strategic way, where you're not just getting a loan and then you're not able to account or actually see advances in your cybersecurity capacity at the end of the day. So if it is that you're going to go the route of, okay, I'm going to go get a loan to improve cybersecurity, think about, should we start first by doing a risk assessment to see where we're most vulnerable? Should we start doing a cybersecurity strategy? So at least when we get the funds, we know where it's going to be allocated for sustainability. So you may say you have a strategy, and then you decide that you need to build capacity within government for training, and you may need to have a consultant on board for a year. You would then, in the loan, say that this consultant is going to be hired to develop material that can be handed over to our police training academy, who would then continue to train police for cybercrime investigation going forward. But we try to encourage that once you think about grants or loans, ensure that it's not just you starting, that being your starting point, but your starting point should be before that, which is your risk assessment, your ability to be able to funnel the funds in a more coordinated way. And yeah, hope that answers. Hello?
Oh, hi, I was on mute. My bad. I would like to add to that a bit as well. I think we're always thinking about funding in terms of money, but there's international cooperation, there's technical assistance, there's capacity building opportunities with the likes of Organization of American States, the Internet Society has a capacity building program, LACNIC has a capacity building program, ITIU, they're by acceding to the Budapest Convention, there are opportunities for knowledge exchange and training. There's also Interpol, which does capacity building and serves as a convener for bringing law enforcement together and training and developing and helping build those capacities within different countries to really address cyber threats.
And that's such a good point, Neil, because what I think a lot of Caribbean countries that we've gotten wrong over the years is thinking about knowledge retention. I think that many of our government officials have been exposed, but whether or not they stay in that field, they may get transferred to another ministry, they may leave and go to private sector. But we need to also, when I think about the strategic aspect of it, how do we build knowledge retention and ensure that institutional memory stays, whether that be through the person comes back from their training and we try to ensure that they train at least 2 others. If we have someone who's in charge of one of our certs, we ensure that they have either students from the university as understudies. So at least if they leave, there's somebody who has the knowledge to continue the work until they get a new boss. But strategically utilizing, as you rightfully said, those avenues, not just through loans, but those capacity building initiatives to continue to ensure that we have year-on-year success. And it's one of the things that the OAS, we are trying to think it through. How can we support our member states in building capacity? When we say building, it's not just giving capacity to one group, but ensure that year on year, we can actually measure the success that this group has moved from this level to that level. I think one of the examples that we've seen is like in Dominican Republic, we've actually seen the maturity grow within the country because they have gotten to the point where they think about institutionalizing some of that knowledge and skill sets and being able to address the threats as they see them. And we have some comments in the chat as well. That would be really good.
Yes, there's a question from Nigel Casimir at CTU. Is beyond the national strategies, what are some of the capabilities or indicators we could be tracking, looking at, or putting in place in order to gauge practical progress in cybersecurity capacity?
I think some of the more practical stuff is starting to talk to your educators to see if we've actually seen an increase in persons entering the digital security field. I think that's one of the most practical things. And then that will be an indicator of how aware are we making our students that this is a possible career in cyber for them to actually pursue. So starting to have more homegrown talent skills in our institutions. Another practical way to measure it is if it is that we do set up an incident response team, whether it be within our academia, within like UE, for example, or if it is within our national certs, is that we actually see that they're able to detect more. Some of the results, because I had a slide I was going to show with defacement websites in the Caribbean, and there was like almost like compared to the rest of the region, it was like just a little bit. And I said I wouldn't show it because it was deceptive to think that, oh, we don't have defacement. But it's a matter that we're not detecting or reporting defacement as much as some of the other countries in the region are. So being able to build those practical capacities where we're actually seeing the tracking of these incidents more and being able to have private sector entities or critical infrastructure entities reported to someone. So we're now able to see a more national level exposure or threat landscape. I think it's another practical way, just to give you more the technical and the education side. But there are many other ways that we could do, but those are two quick things that came to mind.
Okay, thank you. Rodney has asked this, has posed this to me. He's asking if I'm advocating for the region, CARICOM in particular, to sign on to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. And if so, what are some of the reasons that we have not yet done so? That's an interesting question. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of discussions in terms of international corporations, whether it be at the European Council stage, whether it be at the ITIU, even with the Organization of American States. You know, there's been recommendations made to join the Budapest Convention. I think in many countries, what has been an obstacle is that there's not a point person for cybersecurity. There's not a champion for cybersecurity who is really engaging at the international levels and who's responsible for participating in a lot of these international groups. So, you know, as was mentioned earlier at the United Nations GGE, not the GG meeting, there was representation from Antigua, I think, but that was only one country, I think. And just in my participation in the Internet Governance Forum and United Nations special interest groups, many countries just don't have a core point person, and based on the vagaries of government, of the political cycle as well, people who may be put in those positions are not there perpetually, so they may participate for 1 year and 2 years, and then the government changes. But in terms, I think there are a number of reasons that we haven't seen countries in the region accede to the Budapest Convention. But I think a large part of it is many countries aren't aware, and there's no point person to kind of take charge of managing that process and constantly being engaged in those international discussions. There's another question from George Ajam. What are the efforts made by academia, and is there any collaboration to have their efforts engaging effectively?
I think that's a good question, George, because I think there's so much more that the Caribbean could do with academia that we're not doing. How academia is used in some other countries is in the US and the UK, for example, academia does a lot of the future trending, and they do a lot of the more modeling for some of the data that they have access to online to actually predict some of the cyber threats and give recommendations for technical solutions, etc. And what is happening is that I think we've never built that kind of relationship with the technical community within universities in the Caribbean as much as we could. So if it is that we think about it, academia, for example, UA runs throughout the region. And we have some really, really good technical persons coming out of that. And within some of the countries, Trinidad has UTT, Jamaica has some other technical universities that are there. And if you think about how can we be engaging them? We could be engaging them and asking them to do research. We could be engaging them in coming up with models that the government could use for threats. But it all comes down to, do we know what our threat exposure look like? And if we're asking academia to engage, what are we asking them to research? But there's a lot of research they're already doing. And I think in the interim, even utilizing that platform for working with our educators within ministries of education to start looking at curriculum changes, to start looking at how can we insert, if not an entire cybersecurity course, but at least modules within primary level, high school, tertiary level, or community colleges is big in the region. How can we insert cybersecurity modules into these? It's a good way to start engaging from our level. Where some of the more developed nations use them for solutions, we could be using them for capacity building that direction. They're always accustomed to, the provosts always know how to build curriculum, and I think engaging them and giving the support from the technical lecturers that are in our universities, I think the ministries of education could benefit from that. So that's one of the practical ways we could engage, but I don't think it's something we're traditionally accustomed to doing, but in cyber, it's something that we should explore as an option for the Caribbean.
Good point. I think if you look at like the top 100 academic institutions across the world, most every one of them have a cybersecurity program at the master's level. If it's not cybersecurity strategy, it's information assurance. Some of them even have masters of law in cybersecurity law. And in many cases, that's part of an actual conscientious move by the Ministry of Education, by the government, to work with the universities on workforce development, building national capacity to address cyber threats. I think that's something that we really need in our region. What's also very important as well, I think even at the University of the West Indies, in many of the information technology programs or computer science programs, they're not mandatory computer security or network security courses. They're actually elective, and they should be mandatory, because I think anyone getting into a technology field should understand computer security. And I also think what's important too is developing our training capacity. There are a number of cybersecurity certifications, and we need more countries to have training centers that are focusing on developing people to be certified in whether it be cybersecurity, privacy, ethical hacking. There are a lot of different ways you can develop that capacity without being totally dependent on academic institutions.
And that's a good point, Neil, because I was also thinking that in the Caribbean, we tend to drive our students to more traditional jobs, being doctors, engineers, attorneys still. But all of those fields now have to take into account digital technologies. They all have to take into account the impact of digital technologies on their work. So now with telemed, they need to understand cybersecurity at the very basic level in order to protect themselves and their patients and their clients, or whoever it is that they serve. For attorneys, even what Kevin was saying about inserting cybersecurity modules in law school, it's something that's critical, because with e-evidence, being able to do, to manage digital evidence in order to know how to solicit that evidence from the technical officers, speaking to technical officers who are their key witnesses is crucial. In engineering, it's now becoming such a critical component where most of their designs are done through apps and through other, it's not as manual as it used to be. It's completely digitized in some realms. So even in us pursuing or continuing to pursue some of the more traditional things, accounting, now you have to now be working with persons who are working in insurances, because you now have cyber insurance as a big thing. How are we ensuring that our students who are in the Caribbean are now not only thinking of traditional jobs, but we as a government, as a country, are ensuring that they're given the tools within their traditional education to face the digital world that they're going to go out to work in. Why should they have to then be struggling to find certificates when they could actually be provided that as a part of their core learning and their core curriculum?
Good point. Very, very good point. There's a question from Rodney. He's saying, when we train these experts, how do we keep them into the government and the region? There's a global shortage for these skills.
That question is for you, Niel.
Yes, I know. I was trying to allow you to answer it.
I found a quick one. I said, let me look.
Yeah.
I can add some.
Yeah, I think.
Perspective. I think is good.
Brain drain is a very critical challenge that we're faced with. I think there are a lot of contributors to this brain drain. I think the private sector, of course, pays a lot better than government. And I mean, government needs to look at its compensation and structures. You know, you may not fit within a government salary structure, but there may be ways to retain critical skills by engaging them as a consultant, engaging them as an advisor. I think what's important, and something, you know, you may lose someone to an international organization or the private sector, but you can engage them as someone on a statutory board, or as an informal advisor, or as a formal advisor, to provide some of those critical skills. I mean, you're seeing in countries in the European Union, and you're seeing in the United States as well, where governments are mandating that critical infrastructure providers and even specialized government agencies must have a cyber skill set on their advisory boards. So, you know, there are a number of ways to really engage these skill sets, but you really can't depend on the traditional government salary structures, because those salary structures will always be trumped by the private sector.
And to add to your point, and David made a comment in terms of doing legislation which requires organizations of a certain size to hire security and privacy professionals. I don't know how many of you have heard of NICE framework. It's a framework in the US that is used globally now and referred to because it actually gives organizational structures for cybersecurity careers and professions. It gives descriptions of what the roles and functions are. It doesn't speak to like a title necessarily for a cybersecurity professional, but it speaks to the skill sets needed to perform a certain function. And I think that's a good starting point as well for governments to start thinking about the skill sets they need within their organizations. Many of us have just IT support staff, the persons who would come and maybe just do the physical hardware checks, making sure your hardware work, but they're also being asked to perform security functions as well. And how do you ensure that if it is that we can't compensate them, at least they are recognized with their job title so they can actually move on, get the experience there and move on as well. There was a country I came across recently, I can't remember the name of it now because I don't want to give bad information, but the example is still relevant, where they were stuck with doing this. I think it was Jordan. They were stuck like many of us, where we have a structure for our salary scale within public administration for government staff. And what they did, they made a special case to have a separate schedule for cybersecurity and digital security professionals as an emergency case. Because if you realize in our government, persons do get emergency, persons who are considered essential services may be paid a little bit more than persons in some of the traditional jobs. And what they actually did, they made, it's a regulation, but they made it as a separate schedule where those who are digital security professionals, they were able to offer higher salary because they were considered essential. And it's something that you could consider looking at your various laws that you have, and just to see if it's something that's possible, but that they were able to offer higher salaries through that mechanism as well. But I will encourage you to look at the NICE framework, NICE framework. I think that would be a good one to start looking at what the functions and roles would look like within government.
Are there any other Questions? I don't see any hands up. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, Oscar, is there anything you want to say right now? I think we've kind of come to the end of our meeting, it seems.
Niel, I just want to thank Kerry, and of course our audience for joining us today. And I think it is time to close, right?
Yes, indeed it is. So I want to firstly give a big vote of thanks to Kerry-Ann. As usual, her presentations are very informative, very concise, and still filled with very informative views and perspective. I've had the pleasure of hearing her speak a number of times, and she always does a great job. Thank you to the participants for your active participation and engagements. Oscar, thank you for organizing this session, and I'm very appreciative to have been a part of it. So everyone, thank you and have a good day.